What sent you on the journey to disprove the Bible?
Yeah. Got married young, and I was an atheist. My wife was an agnostic. She didn't know what to believe. And she came up to me one day and gave me the worst news any atheist husband could get. She said, I've become a Christian. I thought, oh, great. Now she's going to start judging me. Now she's going to try to get me not to hang out with my friends. Now she's going to make the kids think that there's something wrong with me because I don't believe in God. I thought, I just saw trouble on the horizon. And I thought, I got to get my marriage back together here. How do I do that? Well, wait a minute. There's an easy way. All I have to do is disprove Christianity. I went to Yale Law School. I understand what evidence is. Take me a long weekend, maybe a 3-day weekend, and I'm sure I can poke enough holes in Christianity that it would fall apart. And so I thought I could disprove it. I ended up spending a year and 9 months taking my journalism training, my legal training, and probing the historical data concerning the resurrection of Jesus mainly. Because even as an atheist, I understood everything depends on whether Jesus returned from the dead or not. Because clearly, Jesus made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed he was the Son of God. At one point, he gets up before a group of people, and he says, I and the Father are one. And the word in Greek there for one is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And the audience got it. They said, oh, you're a man and you're claiming to be God. So they were going to kill him for claiming to be God. Well, he claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. Everybody could claim that they're God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth. So I was stunned because I did not expect there to be any historical validity to the fact that Jesus died on a cross and rose from the dead. But I can summarize it really quickly, what I found, using 4 words that begin with the letter E. That way people can remember. Because remember, it's Christmas. The reason Jesus came was Easter, the resurrection. How do we know it's true? 4 words that begin with the letter E. Execution. Jesus was dead after being crucified. I thought maybe he survived, and the cool, damp air of the tomb resuscitated him. That's what I thought. No, we have no record anywhere of anyone surviving a full Roman crucifixion, anywhere. Not only do we have multiple accounts in the documents of the New Testament that tell us that Jesus was dead after being crucified, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible that talk about him being dead.
What are those sources?
Oh, like Josephus, Tacitus. These are early historians, Mirabar Serapion, Lucian. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that Jesus was executed. So Jesus was clearly dead. In fact, get this. The Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And this was their conclusion, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. So that's the Journal of the American Medical Association. You could go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann, and he will tell you the death of Jesus on the cross by crucifixion is historically indisputable. That's the atheist speaking. So the first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for early reports that he rose from the dead. In other words, reports that didn't come after decades of legendary development, but go right back to the cross itself. In other words, I used to think as a skeptic, okay, I got to give you the fact Jesus was dead, get it. But the resurrection is a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. Well, what I learned is that we have a report of the resurrection of Jesus, including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses that said he died, why? For our sins. He was buried. On the 3rd day, he rose from the dead. And these eyewitnesses, groups of eyewitnesses and individuals, this report has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death. Wow. Within months. Yeah, wow. It's about the resurrection of Jesus. Who wrote 1 Corinthians? Paul. Paul had been someone who didn't believe in God. He was a Pharisee. He didn't believe in Jesus. He was persecuting Christians. He's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He realizes Jesus is God, and he becomes the Apostle Paul. 22 years later, he writes this letter to the church in Corinth. That's what we call 1 Corinthians in the Bible. And he includes this report about the resurrection. Where did he get that report? Well, we know that it was 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus that he had this experience with the risen Christ and became the Apostle Paul. He immediately went into Damascus and he met with some apostles. Many people believe that's when he was given this report about the resurrection. Some people believe it was a couple years later, he went to Jerusalem and he met for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who were mentioned in that report, Peter and James. And the Greek word that Paul uses to describe that meeting is this is an investigative meeting. They're checking each other out. What did you see? What do you know? What do you know for sure? What do you experience? Some people believe that's when he was given this report by 2 people named in the report. But either way, it means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed, this report is already in existence. And therefore the beliefs that make up this report go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. So we got an execution, we got the early report. Third E is empty tomb. And what's interesting about that is even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. How do we know? Because we know from history, sources inside and outside the Bible, that when the disciples began saying, oh, Jesus had been resurrected, what the enemies of Jesus said was, the disciples stole his body. Think about that. That's a cover story. They're admitting the tomb is empty. They're just saying, this is how it got empty. They stole the body. So they're conceding implicitly that the tomb is empty. So even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. The disciples didn't have the motive, the means, or the opportunity to steal the body. Nobody did. And then we look at the fourth E, eyewitnesses. Most of what we accept as being true from the ancient world is based on maybe one source or 2 sources of information. When you get right down to it, we know things about famous people through ancient history because maybe 1 source or 2 sources. For the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data. Now, let's think about the disciples. Of all human beings who've ever lived on the planet, they were in a unique position. They were there. They touched the resurrected Jesus. They talked with him. They ate with him. Of all people who ever lived, they knew the truth about whether he had returned from the dead and proved he's the Son of God, because they were there. They knew the truth. Knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. That's the difference. And a light bulb went on. I said, whoa, I get it. That gives me confidence in what they were saying, because they were there, they touched him, they ate with him, they talked to him. They knew whether this was a lie. Somebody said to me, Lee, nobody knowingly and willingly dies for what they know is a lie.
Wow.
That was the last puzzle piece. It was November the 8th of 1981. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 3 p.m. And I thought, I believe, based on the data of history, that Jesus claimed to be God and backed it up by returning from the dead. But now what? Do I just go back to life? Because remember, the demons believe this too, and they shudder. And then my wife, Leslie, pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. So I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete, total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God.